Hey everyone, at Siggraph 2022, I co-hosted many events, but two that stood out to me were RenderFarming and Studio Storage. They were both birds of a feather discussions. I gathered all the notes from that discussion, and we're going to talk about it right now on A Cup of Joe. First, a little background. The Birds of a Feather discussions at Siggraph traditionally are group discussions amongst peers and folks from the industry that are going to be talking in an interactive open forum. That's the ideal Birds of a Feather discussion, and I helped co-host two of them. One of them was RenderFarming, which specifically looks at on-prem and hybrid render farm dynamics. This conversation was going on for the first years that I started at Siggraph, and then unfortunately during the pandemic years, this particular Birds of a Feather fell off the schedule. So I worked with some studio managers and the original organizers of that Birds of a Feather and relaunched the RenderFarming Birds of a Feather discussion, which I thought was fairly successful. But at the suggestion of another colleague of mine, it was, let's break out Studio Storage as its own conversation. This is primarily because the RenderFarming conversation tended to get overwhelmed by the storage aspect of render farming. Really, the two go together like peanut butter and jelly, like I always say. And so we ended up having these conversations back to back, one on a Wednesday, one on a Thursday. A lot of the same people participated, and I want to thank everyone who came. It's always a great eclectic mix of various studio representatives, usually CTOs and system administrators and everyone in between. There's always a handful of folks that are my former bosses, which always makes me feel a little nervous. I probably am more nervous and jittery in those conversations more than any, because I know that half of my bosses from my old studios are there representing their current studios. And then there's other folks that are there that are actually people who I hired and brought on, or folks that I've contracted with. So really my entire render farm career is wrapped up in this conversation with all the parties present throughout all of my render farming career. It always makes an added level of pressure for me to perform and really make sure that I'm adding value to the conversation as a co-organizer. I tried to take the best notes that I could and harvest some comments from the chat log. The notes are in bullet point form, so I couldn't do deep dives and cover what everyone was saying. And it really led me to wanting to discuss next year about us possibly allowing this to be recorded so people can learn and get the full breadth of the conversation. Or I can try to bring someone in just to take prolific notes, because I can only take so good of notes when I'm also co-organizing and hosting the conversation itself, right? I'll put a link to the RenderFarming and Studio Storage notes. And this new Studio Storage Birds of a Feather is really just a continuation of that RenderFarming discussion, where we go from talking about the render nodes and the technology of scheduling and setting up a farm to the storage side, which is integral to the conversation. When we look at the render farming part of the conversation, we started where we left off in 2019, which was a big conversation about the profiling and tuning of I/O, or the input-output aspects of rendering. In other words, how the files get from the disk to the render node and back ends up being the biggest focus of efficiency. At least it was in 2019. So I thought we would start the conversation there. We talked about optimizing jobs. We talked about I/O profiling. There was general agreement on the idea that you should try to run like or similar frames with similar I/O patterns on the same machine. This is especially true with the newest versions of Linux, because the Linux caching that's been built into the newest versions of Linux, thanks to the work of DNAG and other folks, they basically have ramped up Linux so that you can have a caching mechanism within the operating system, and you can run multiple frames from that machine, and it's only caching the files in that one time. As far as that Linux caching technology, I did put some links within the notes, so if you want to learn more about that, I highly encourage you to. So again, we talked about profiling, optimizing renders, the virtualization of local hosts versus bare metal hosts, and containerization. We talked about the movement to a hybrid farm with the load mix between a local on-prem farm, procurement of private cloud, and then use of the hyperscalers. We talked about the integration of ML tasks, getting onto the farm, orchestration and automation. We discussed the trusted partner network and the whole security aspect of operating a hybrid farm. We went into the adoption of GPU because this is becoming far more widespread, and we discussed adding GPUs or switching to GPUs in your rendering model. There were some additional points from the audience that I highlighted within the notes. And in these same notes is the second conversation, which is studio storage. There we went into a deep conversation about tiering and whether or not you need to tier your storage or whether or not you can just go all flash. There's different ways to go about the all flash solutions and whether or not that's even affordable or scalable or achievable. We went into talking about caching versus pre-staging data. This is in a post-Avere world. The Avere caching appliance was a main building block of a lot of studios' infrastructure. And now that Avere was purchased by Microsoft and is really focused on Azure, we went into details about how folks are dealing with this. We went into analytics and the specific ways that people are dealing with analytics or identifying how to sync files between different locations, whether that's on-prem and the farm or multiple locations. That's becoming a big conversation for studio storage. Some people had questions about difficulties applying ACLs or ACL permissions. They get pretty deep into the weeds with some of these conversations. Some people were asking about running Ceph or essentially rolling your own storage. That's becoming rather popular on the smaller studios. There are some larger studios that also do it that way, but you really need to have the infrastructure in both personnel and hardware to achieve those roll your own solutions. In both birds of a feather, we went into USD or Universal Scene Description and the effects that it has on managing files. It turns out that the use of USD has thrown some curveballs for the folks who need to manage file space and where the files are. Some people had some questions about Netflix Drive, and we put a few links into there that people were adding to the conversation. There was a few points towards the end about asking about these sort of database technologies people are using to track their assets. And again, there were some additional points from the audience that I highlighted within the notes. So like I said, there's a link to the description to these studio notes. I encourage you to go through them, check out the bullet points. If you have specific questions, some of the notes are a little obscure, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to give more details, or you can comment here in the video and I'll answer your questions there. I really want to appreciate Amandeep from Pixar, Susan Fong from NVIDIA. Without them, I really couldn't have achieved the great results we got. And I got some excellent feedback from all the people who attended that it was a robust session. It always feels a little awkward for me trying to draw out the conversation in these Zoom sessions, but we had some great participants, some great information, and I want to thank everyone who joined the conversation. The quality of these birds of a feather conversations are not a product of the organizers, but they're a product and a function of the attendees. So I encourage folks who are attending these open sessions, whether it's mine or others, to do whatever you can to turn on your camera, join the conversation, put your comments in the chat log if you're not comfortable speaking to the camera. But it's really important that all your voices get added. And the more people add their voice, the more value there is to having these conversations. So thanks again to everybody. Thanks again to Siggraph for allowing these to happen. Thanks to the organizers who helped me put this together. Thanks to the studio leadership who helped me get my thoughts straight on how we should go about these conversations. And thanks to CDW for allowing me some time on the clock to pull all this together and make it happen. Thank you, the viewers, supporters, and subscribers of A Cup of Joe. The channel had a lot of great feedback at Siggraph, and I appreciate any feedback you might have about what you want to see on this channel or what conversations you'd like to see addressed in future videos. So please comment below or send me an email. See you later, everybody.